I'll tear you apart.
Try it, and I'll end this in 3 seconds.
The night was heavy with the smell of old smoke and spilled beer, and the sound of low laughter mixed with the sharp clatter of pool balls bouncing on green felt as Maya pushed open the creaking wooden door of the biker bar and stepped inside. And for a moment, the world seemed to pause, as if even the dust in the air wanted to see what she was about to do, because a place like this was no place for a woman like her. And yet she had chosen to come because she was tired of fear and tired of silence and tired of letting the world decide where she belonged and where she did not. And so she came carrying only her small purse and the strength she had built across a lifetime of pain and fire, and she stood there in a plain white blouse and faded jeans, her shoes wet from the rain outside, her hair tied back in a simple knot, her dark eyes steady and calm, and her chin lifted with quiet defiance as the men inside turned their heads and stared at her as if a ghost had walked into their world, and some of them laughed and slapped the tables while others frowned and narrowed their eyes, and one or two leaned forward in their chairs, as though to catch the scent of her courage, and the bartender froze behind the counter, a glass half polished in his hand, unsure whether to pour her a drink or warn her to turn back, because he had seen enough trouble in this place to know how fast things could spin out of control. And in the far corner, under a broken light that flickered on and off, sat a tall man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, and his name was Clinton. He was the leader of this group, and the one nobody dared to cross, and he leaned back in his chair, his leather jacket stretched across his shoulders, his boots resting on the edge of the table, and his eyes gleamed with the kind of hunger that was not for food or drink, but for power and for the chance to remind everyone who owned this space. And when he saw Maya, he grinned a grin that was not joy but warning, and it spread across his scarred face like a blade drawn from its sheath. And the men at his table chuckled low, because they knew that grin, and they knew what it meant, and they knew someone was about to be broken. But Maya did not shrink and did not falter. She walked straight to the counter, her shoes tapping a steady rhythm on the old wooden floor, and the sound carried across the bar, louder than the music and louder than the laughter, because her steps did not shake and her back did not bend. And when she reached the bar, she placed her purse down with calm hands and said in a voice as steady as a church bell, "A glass of water, please." And the words cut through the smoky air like a blade through cloth, and for a breath the bar seemed to freeze, because it was not what they expected her to say. They expected her to ask for a beer or for nothing at all, but water was a stranger in this place, and so was she. And that was when Clint slammed his beer bottle down on the table with such force that the glass shattered, and the sound rang out like a shot, and the walls seemed to tremble. And every eye turned to him as he rose slowly from his chair, moving toward her step by step, his boots striking the floor like drums, each step louder than the last, until even the jukebox in the corner seemed to fall silent, and the card games and pool games stopped, and men who had been laughing only moments before now leaned back with sharp eyes, waiting to see what their leader would do, because Clint did not like to be challenged, and he did not like strangers, especially not ones who looked like Maya and carried themselves like they belonged. And when he reached her, he leaned close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, and he said in a low, mocking tone, "Why does a woman like you think she belongs here?" And his words were sharp and heavy with threat, but Maya did not flinch. She looked up at him without blinking and said, "I belong anywhere God gives me the strength to stand." And her words did not shake, and her eyes did not fall, and for a moment Clint's grin faltered, because he was not used to being answered like that, and especially not by someone who looked so small and so calm, and yet carried herself like a mountain that would not move. But then his grin twisted back across his scarred face, and he laughed a cruel laugh that bounced off the walls and made the men around him chuckle, though their eyes were not sure. And in that moment, before anyone could move, Clint reached out with his rough hand and grabbed the collar of her blouse, and with a jerk of his arm he tore the fabric at the shoulder, and the sound of ripping cloth was loud enough to slice through the Silence, and the blouse fell open across her skin and exposed the mark she had carried hidden for years, and for a moment time itself seemed to stop because everyone in the smoky room saw the tattoo inked across her shoulder, and their laughter died in their throats, and their eyes grew wide, and the air grew heavy with something none of them understood at first. But Clint understood, because he froze and his hand dropped and his face went pale, and he whispered, "No, it cannot be," as if he had seen a ghost, and whispers rose across the room as men leaned forward, craning to see, because the tattoo was no ordinary mark. It was a crest, bold and sharp, inked in strong black lines that told a story of blood and bone, and it spoke of generations that had crossed oceans and chains and pain, yet still survive, and around the crest were words carved in English, words that read, "I rise again," and those words were not just ink, they were fire, and they burned across her skin and across the room. And Clint stumbled back as if struck by a blow, because the tattoo was a ghost from his own past, and he remembered a night long ago, when he had been a reckless boy racing his bike through the rain, and a truck had slammed into him, and fire had swallowed him, and he had screamed until his voice broke, and the flames wrapped around him like hungry snakes, but strong arms had dragged him free, and a deep voice had whispered, "You will live, son." And the man who saved him was a black soldier with eyes full of kindness and steel, and that soldier had been Maya's father, and Clint had never known his name, but he had carried the memory like a stone in his pocket through all the years of rage and cruelty, and now standing before him was the daughter of that man, and the tattoo was the proof, and his voice cracked as he said, "Your father saved my life," and the words broke the silence like thunder, and Maya stood tall, not hiding the mark and not covering her torn blouse, and she said in a voice as steady as thunder, "I am his daughter, and I carry his courage." And the bar trembled, not with fear, but with awe, because strength had walked into that place, and it was not fists or knives or scars. It was truth, and it was unbreakable, and for the first time in years, Clint felt the weight of respect pressing on his shoulders like a mountain, and he fell to his knees as if crushed not by defeat but by memory and by truth. Clint was still on his knees when the silence of the bar grew so heavy that even the smoke curling up from half-finished cigarettes seemed to hang in place, and the bikers, who had always followed him because he was the strongest man they knew, now stared at Maya with eyes full of questions, because what they were seeing did not fit the world they understood, and Clint's hand shook as it pressed against the floorboards, and his scarred face looked older than any of them had ever seen. And he whispered again as if to himself, "Her father saved me. Her father pulled me out of the fire, and I have lived my whole life like I owed nothing to anyone, but I owed everything to him." And the weight of those words made the men at the table exchange uneasy glances, because they had never heard Clint speak with weakness and never seen him bow his head. Maya did not let the moment pass. She stepped forward with calm steps, her torn blouse still hanging loose across her shoulder, the tattoo glowing like a flame in the dim light, and she said in a voice that carried across the room, "Then honor his memory not with fear but with change," and her words carried such weight that Clint's body shook and his knees buckled, and the man who had once been the terror of the streets dropped fully to the floor, whispering, forgive me," and his shoulders quaked. But Maya reached out her hand and rested it gently on his shoulder, and she said, "The forgiveness is not mine to give. You must forgive yourself," and the words landed like stones in a pond, sending ripples through every man in that place. And one of the younger bikers, barely more than 20, whispered, "She is stronger than all of us," and the others turned to look at him, but Maya's eyes found his, and she spoke directly to him and to all of them when she said, "Strength is not shown by how much you can break, but by how much you can heal." And the words pierced him so deeply that he clenched his fists to keep from crying, because he had grown up in shelters bouncing between homes, never knowing the arms of a father or the comfort of a mother, and he had raised his fists long before he ever learned to read, because fighting was the only way he thought people would notice him, and fear was the only thing he thought could protect him. But now this woman stood in front of him, small and calm with torn clothes, and a burning tattoo, and she had turned a room full of wolves into sheep without lifting. A hand in Clint looked up from his knees, tears burning through the grime on his cheeks, and he said, "Your father pulled me from death, and you have pulled me from myself." And Maya's eyes softened, but before she could answer, the fragile silence cracked like glass, because at the far side of the room a chair scraped hard against the floor, and another man stood, and the rage on his face was a storm waiting to explode, and his name was Mason, and he had been sitting quiet the whole time, but inside his chest fire had been burning hotter with each word. Maya spoke because Mason had been waiting for years for Clint to stumble so he could take the throne, and now Clint was kneeling like a broken man, and the crown of fear that Mason had always wanted was finally within reach, but it was not his to claim because the room's eyes were on Maya, and he could not bear it. And he shouted loud enough to rattle the walls, "This is weakness, a woman cannot rule us, we are not here to listen to fairy tales about healing." And his words cracked across the bar like thunder, and some of the bikers jerked in their chairs and looked at him, because Mason was not just angry, he was dangerous. His fists were like iron, and his heart was like stone. And he had no memory of a soldier saving his life, no tattoo to respect, no reason to bow to Maya. He had only his hunger for power and his hatred for anything that threatened it. And he marched across the floor, his boots striking fast, and he shoved Clint out of the way, sending him sprawling, and he pointed at Maya with eyes like burning coal, and he spat, "You do not belong here," and his voice carried rage and hate and fear, all twisted together, and Clint tried to rise and block him, but Mason shoved him back like he was nothing, and the bikers who had seen Clint rule for years were shaken because Mason looked like he might take control by sheer force, and Maya stood there, her eyes calm and her voice unbroken, as she answered, "I do not seek to belong to you, I belong to truth." And the words were so sharp that Mason actually stopped for half a breath, but his pride would not let him bow, and he roared louder, his fists tightening until his knuckles cracked, and he lunged forward to grab her arm, and the room gasped, because everyone expected violence to return and expected blood to spill. But Maya had not walked this road unprepared. She had spent her life carrying the weight of pain and turning it into strength, and she stepped aside with grace, and Mason's hand cut through empty air, and he stumbled forward just enough to lose his balance, and before he could strike again, she pulled her torn blouse higher, revealing the tattoo fully under the lights so every eye could see, and her voice thundered across the room, "This is the mark of survival. This is the mark of every woman who has been broken and still stood tall. This is the mark of fire that cannot be put out." And the words rolled like thunder, and Mason froze, because the bikers who had been ready to cheer for him were silent, their heads turning not toward him, but toward her, and one by one heads began to bow, because even men who had known nothing but fear could not deny the truth when it burned so brightly in front of them. And Maya's voice softened, but grew stronger like a river carving stone, and she said, "I am not here to fight you. I am here to show you that there is another way tonight. You can choose what kind of men you will be. Do you want to be chains, or do you want to be freedom?" And her words filled the smoke-filled air and pressed into their bones, and Mason felt it, but he fought it with every breath, because all his life he had clung to rage as his only strength. And yet here he was trembling, because for the first time he felt something he had never known, and that was respect, not for fists, not for fear, but for truth. And he tried to raise his fists again, but they felt heavy like chains pulling him down, and sweat rolled down his forehead as he stared at her, and the room stared at him, and the balance of power that had always been decided by blood and fear now hung in the silence of one woman's words, and the bikers who had once believed only in violence now found themselves believing that maybe there was another way. And Mason trembled, caught between his rage and a respect he could not crush. The bar was holding its breath as Mason stood trembling in front of Maya, his fists still clenched, but his arms weighed down as if invisible chains were pulling them to the floor, and sweat poured down his forehead, and his chest heaved like a wild animal cornered by a fire. It could not escape, and Clint had risen to his feet again, his knees still weak, but his eyes steady, because he saw in Mason what he had once seen in himself, a man who had mistaken fear for power and rage for strength. And he spoke with a voice low but sharp, "Listen to her, Mason, she carries the strength of the man who saved me, and she carries more than you, and I have ever known." And Mason snarled at him, but the fire in his eyes was not steady anymore, it was cracked with doubt, and Maya stepped closer until she was near enough to see the tremble in his jaw, and she said, "Mason, you are not my enemy. You are your own enemy, and every time you raise your fist against someone weaker than you, you prove that you are still chained by your own pain, and you can fight me here. And you can fight me now, but you will never win until you fight yourself." And her words landed heavy in the silence like hammers against stone, and Mason tried to open his mouth to curse her, but the words would not come because inside his chest something else was breaking loose. Memories he had kept locked away for years came rushing back like a flood, and he saw himself as a boy hiding under a table while his father smashed bottles against the wall, and his mother cried out in pain, and he remembered the sound of his own heartbeat pounding with terror, and the vow he made to himself that he would never be weak again and never let anyone see his tears. And so he built his life on rage, wearing anger like armor and striking first before anyone could strike him, and every scar on his hands was proof of how far he had gone to bury his own fear. And yet here he was standing before a woman who had not raised a hand to him, and yet she had pierced straight through that armor and spoken words that felt truer than all his years of fury. And she said again, "You can still choose, Mason, you can break the chain tonight." And the words cracked him open, and for the first time he felt shame heavy and burning across his shoulders, and he trembled, and his fists began to loosen, and the bikers, watching, leaned forward, their breaths caught, because they had never seen Mason falter, and they had never seen him do anything but strike and roar. But now his body sagged as if the rage that had carried him was leaking out, and he sank into a chair like a man whose strength had been stolen, and he buried his face in his hands. And to the shock of every man in that room, he wept. And the sound of his sobs was not soft. It was raw and heavy, and it filled the bar with a sound none of them had ever thought they would hear from him. And the bikers, who had followed him in fear, now sat frozen, their faces hard, but their hearts shaken, because the man they thought was iron had broken in front of them. And Clint stood beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder, rough and scarred, but steady, and he said, "Mason, you are not alone. We have all lived in shadows too long, and she has shown us light." And Mason lifted his tear-streaked face and whispered, "I do not know how to change. I only know rage." And his voice cracked like glass, but Clint squeezed his shoulder and answered, "Then start small tonight. You put your fists down. Tomorrow you put down your hate. The next day you put down your fear, and each day you will lay something down until you are free." And the words struck the room like sparks, and one of the bikers across the table whispered, "I lost my son to prison, and I drink every night to forget." And another said, "I grew up hungry, and I stole, and I never forgave myself." And another said, "I have not spoken to my mother in 10 years because I was too proud, and now I want to see her again." And one by one voices rose, not in anger but in confession, and the bar that had once shaken with violence and cruelty now shook with truth. And Maya stood among them, her tattoo burning bright, her torn blouse hanging open, but her face steady as stone and her eyes wet with unshed tears, because she knew the journey had only begun, but she also knew healing had started, and healing, once begun, could not be stopped. And the sound of men confessing filled the bar until the smoke itself seemed to lift, and every man there felt the weight of years slide from his shoulders. And Maya lifted her hand and spoke, "One last time, that night you will rise again." And her words wrapped around them like a promise, and the promise clung to their hearts like fire that could not be put out. The rain outside was falling harder, now beating against the dusty windows in heavy drops like a drum that would not stop, and the sound mixed with the silence in the bar, making the room feel like a world apart. As Maya turned toward the door, ready to step back into the storm, her heart steady, though her body was heavy with everything that had just happened. And as she reached for the handle, She heard footsteps and a young voice shaking with fear and hope call out, "Wait, please," and she turned and saw a girl no more than 20 running toward her with wet blonde hair clinging to her face and bruises dark along her arms, like chains burned into her skin, and the girl stopped short, breathing hard, and said, "My name is Lily, and I have been with this group for 2 years because I had nowhere else to go. My parents threw me out. When I was 16, my friends forgot me, and I was hungry and cold until I found this place, and they told me every day that I was worthless, and I believed them. Because when you are alone long enough, you start to think the lies must be true. But tonight, when you stood there and did not break, even when Clint tore your blouse, even when Mason tried to crush you, I saw myself in you, and I want to be strong too." And Maya felt her chest ache because she knew that pain she had carried words like those inside her own heart as a girl, and she stepped forward and took Lily's trembling hands and said, "You are already strong because you came out here, and you spoke, and that is the first step." And Lily's face crumpled, and she broke down sobbing and buried her face in Maya's shoulder, and Maya held her like a sister, whispering, "Tomorrow we will find you a safe place. You do not need to live in chains anymore." And Lily nodded, her face wet with tears, but her eyes glowing with the faint light of hope that had been buried for years. And Maya smiled, though tears filled her own eyes, because she knew this was how change began, not with crowds, not with banners, not with armies, but with one broken soul daring to believe again. And as she held Lily, she felt the power of her father's blood and her mother's strength running through her veins, reminding her that courage was not loud, it was steady. And it was contagious. And when they walked back into the bar together, Maya leading Lily by the hand, every man turned his head because they saw something new in the young woman who had once sat at their tables silent and afraid, and now she stood with Maya, her face streaked with tears, but her back straighter than ever before. And Clint looked at her and then at Maya and nodded, because he knew that night was not just about men laying down fists, it was about women finding voices they had been told to bury. And Mason lifted his face from his hands and stared at Lily, as if seeing her for the first time, not as an object or a shadow, but as a soul, and his lips trembled, though no words came out, and Clint spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "We have both lived in shadows too long. She showed us light, and if we want to honor her father who saved me, and honor her who stood unbroken, we must change." And Mason's lips cracked as he whispered, "I do not know how to change, I only know rage." And Clint's rough, scarred hand gripped his shoulder and said, "Then start small tonight. You put your fists down tomorrow. You put down your hate. The next day you put down your fear, and each day you will lay something down until you are free." And Mason closed his eyes and shook, but nodded, and around them the other bikers shifted, restless and uneasy, because they had never been asked to speak of anything but violence. But one by one voices began to rise. A man with gray in his beard said, "I lost my son to prison because I raised him in my anger, and I drink every night to forget." And another said, "I stole food as a boy to feed my sisters, and I never forgave myself." And another, with tattoos running up his neck, said, "I left my mother 10 years ago and never looked back because I was too proud and too broken to face her." And another said, "My wife begged me to stop fighting, and I walked out on her, and I wonder if she still prays for me." And the voices filled the bar, rising and falling like a river bursting through a dam, and the confessions poured out raw and heavy. But with each word the air grew lighter, as if the weight was leaving their bodies. And Maya listened, her eyes shining and her blouse torn wide, so that her tattoo burned bright in the dim light. And she raised her arm and said, "This mark is not mine alone. It belongs to every one of you who has been crushed and still stands, who has fallen and still rises. It belongs to you if you choose it." And the men bowed their heads, because for the first time they understood that strength was not fists or scars. It was the courage to confess and to change. And Clint, who had once ruled them by fear, now stood among them as one of them, not above them. And Mason, who had tried to seize power by rage, now sat humbled, his tears streaking his face, but his heart cracked open. And Lily looked around at the men who had once laughed at her and sneered at her, And she said softly, I want to believe we can all be different, and the words struck them harder than any blow because they knew she was right, and they knew she had been one of their victims, and now she was speaking with the voice of hope, and the bar no longer smelled of smoke and blood. It smelled of rain and change, and when the night drew long and the storm outside began to quiet, the men did not return to cards or bottles. They sat in a circle around Maya and Lily, and they spoke of the lives they wanted to live, of the fathers they wanted to become, of the sons and daughters they longed to see again. And Maya listened and guided them, her words simple but sharp. And when at last she stood to leave again, Clint walked her to the door and whispered, thank you for reminding me who I could be. And she smiled and answered, remember it every day. And Mason stepped forward too, his eyes red and swollen, but his voice clear, and he said, I will try. And she laid a hand on his arm and said, trying is the first step, keep walking. And he nodded. And the rest of the men bowed their heads as she left into the rain, her torn blouse fluttering, her tattoo glowing under the streetlights. And Lily followed her, holding her hand because she knew her chains were broken. And as they walked away into the storm, Maya whispered, we will rise again. And the city seemed to whisper back, yes, you will. The morning after the storm, the bar smelled like soap and new wood. Sunlight slid through the dusty windows and fell on tired faces and hopeful eyes. Maya stood in the doorway with Lily by her side, and she breathed in peace. Clint swept the floor with slow care, like a man cleaning his own heart. Mason stacked chairs and wiped tables, and his hands no longer shook with rage. The men moved in quiet rhythm like workers at a small church. Maya spoke to them with simple words that felt strong and clear. She said, today, we start with small steps, and we keep walking. She said, fear will return, and shame will whisper, but we will answer with truth. She said, this place will become a house of healing, and not a house of hurt. Clint nodded and said, we will make it safe for every person who enters. Mason said, we will protect the weak, and we will protect ourselves from our old ways. Lily pulled a notebook from a shelf and wrote a list with steady hands. She wrote paint walls, and she wrote fix lights, and she wrote ask the bakery for bread. The list grew until the page was full, and her face glowed with purpose. Men who once shouted now asked gentle questions and waited for answers. One man said, I can fix the door, and another said, I can patch the roof. Another said, I can cook a big pot of soup for anyone who is hungry. By noon the street smelled like paint and spices and warm bread. Neighbors peeked in and their eyes opened wide at the sight. Some turned away with doubt, and some stepped inside with careful steps. Maya greeted each person with a smile that felt like sunlight. She said, welcome, and come sit and have water and have rest. An old woman came in with a cane, and she looked at Clint with fear. She said, your face has frightened me for years, and I have prayed for safety. Clint bowed his head and said, you were right to fear me then. He said, you will not need to fear me now, and you will not need to fear here. He pulled out a chair and helped her sit and poured water with gentle hands. The old woman touched his scar and said, may you be a guardian now. Clint nodded and tears filled his eyes, but he kept working. Mason walked outside and picked up trash from the gutter in the alley. He found a rusted chain, and he held it in his palm for a long time. He whispered, I put you down, and then he dropped it into the bin. That simple act felt like a promise, and he breathed out long. Lily painted flowers on the front window with bold strokes and bright colors. She painted a small bird with open wings above the words, I rise again. Children stopped and watched, and one little boy pointed and smiled. He said, the bird looks free, and Lily nodded and said, you can be free too. The boy said, my dad gets angry, and he shouts and breaks things. Lily knelt and said, your feelings matter, and you are not the anger. She said, you can learn safe words and safe places and safe friends. His mother wiped her eyes and thanked Lily for her kindness. Maya saw this and felt hope grow like a steady flame in her chest. She knew the work was hard, but she also knew the work was holy. In the afternoon, a reporter came with a camera and a notepad. She asked what happened here last night and why this place looks new. Maya looked at Clint and Mason and Lily and then back at the reporter. She said truth happened and courage happened and healing began. The reporter asked who is the leader of this change and this house. Maya said love is the leader and we only follow its path. The reporter asked about the tattoo and about the words. Maya pulled her blouse aside and showed the mark with calm pride. She said, "This is my promise to rise after every fall." She said these words belong to anyone who chooses them today. The reporter took a photo and her hands shook a little. She said, "I have covered crime for years and I rarely cover grace." She said, "I think people should know that grace still lives." By evening the story was online and people started to come. Some brought bread and some brought paint and some brought music. An old guitar found a home in the corner near the jukebox. A quiet man tuned the strings and began to play slow songs. Voices rose soft at first and then stronger and clearer. The bar felt like a living room where strangers became neighbors. Later that week, Maya helped Lily find a safe room to rent. They met a woman who ran a shelter and she offered a bed. Lily shook as she signed the form and then she smiled. She said, "I never thought I would have a key of my own." She said, "I will still come help at the bar every day." Maya hugged her and said, "This place will also help you grow." Lily hung the key on a string and wore it around her neck. It felt like a medal for a battle won with quiet courage. Clint started a new habit every morning at sunrise. He walked to the bridge where the river bent around the town. He threw a small stone into the water and he whispered a name. Some days, he said the name of a man he had hurt. Some days he said the name of his own young self. Then he said the words, "I forgive you and I ask for mercy." He stood there until the river carried the ripples away. He returned to the bar and worked with simple joy. Mason began a journal with help from Maya and Lily. He wrote, "I feel angry and I feel afraid and I feel cold." Then he wrote, "I want peace and I want trust and I want rest." He read the words to Maya like a boy reading his first book. She said, "Your voice is learning a new song and I hear it." Mason nodded and kept writing and did not hide tears. On Fridays, the bar opened its doors for family night. They pushed the tables together to make one long board. They served soup and bread and greens and sweet tea. People prayed or kept silence or told long stories. A rule hung on the wall in black paint and big letters. It said, "No fists, no hate, no shame in this place." It said, "All wounds can be named and all hearts can be mended." A young mother came with 2 kids and stood by the door. She looked ready to run and ready to fight for them. Maya walked to her and said, "You are safe here with us." The mother whispered, "My husband is angry and I am scared." Maya said, "You can sit near me and you can breathe." Clint found the kids' crayons and blank paper to draw. They drew the bird that Lily had painted and they smiled. Mason kept watch at the door, but his face was kind. He greeted each guest with words soft like warm bread. One night, a man from another biker group came in. He wore a jacket with hard patches and old dust. He looked at Mason and cracked his knuckles and stared. Mason lifted his hands to show they were empty and open. He said, "We do not fight here, and we do not harm here." The man laughed and said, "I came to see if you got soft." Mason said, "I got honest, and I invite you to sit with us." The man stood still for a long time, and then he sat. He ate soup and listened to the guitar and wiped his eyes. Before he left, he shook Mason's hand and nodded once. The next week he returned with 3 friends who were quiet. They stayed through the night and helped stack chairs after. The circle of change widened like ripples in a lake. News spread beyond the town and people sent letters. They wrote, "Thank you for being brave," and "We believe again." Some wrote, "Please teach us how to start in our own place." Maya answered each note with care and with gentle steps. She wrote, "Start small and speak truth and stay kind under fire." She wrote, "Fall down and rise again and repeat as needed." She wrote, "Keep the door open even when fear shouts loud." In the spring, they painted a mural on the side wall. Lily sketched a wide river with many small boats in it. Each boat held a person with a light in their hands. At the far bank, a great tree lifted branches toward the sky. Clint painted the roots deep and strong in the ground. Mason painted the boat steady on the moving water. Maya painted the words we crossed together in quiet faith. Children dipped brushes and added stars and little birds. The wall glowed with color and hope and clean lines. A teacher brought her class to look and to listen. Maya told them a story in simple sentences and pauses. She said light travels faster in open hearts than in open roads. She said hurt can make walls and truth can make doors. She said you are never too young to bring water to a fire. The kids clapped and asked to visit again next month. In summer, the bar held a day of service for the block. They fixed fences and planted flowers and picked weeds. They gave free haircuts and washed bikes and mended tires. A nurse set up a small table to check blood pressure. A counselor sat in a corner and listened without hurry. People laughed and shared food and told old stories. At sunset, Maya stood on a crate and raised her hands. She said, I thank every person here for choosing life. She said, I honor the ones who fell and got back up. She said, this work is not easy, but it is worth every step. The crowd answered with cheers and with quiet tears. Lily looked at the sky and felt her chest open wide. She had a job at the bakery now and a key to her room. She paid her rent on time and planted a small herb pot. She chose a basil sprout and named it Victory Day. She met with girls at the shelter once every week. She said, I know your fear and I know your voice matters. She taught them how to make a plan and call for help. She taught them how to speak a strong no without shame. She told them that scars are maps that can guide you home. She held their hands when memories rose like storms. She sat with them until the storms passed into quiet. Sometimes Maya joined and shared from her own road. She told them about nights when she cried and still rose. She told them about faith, like a small lamp in a long tunnel. She told them about the day she chose courage over fear. On a clear morning, Clint knocked on Maya's door. He held a folded flag that a soldier had given long ago. He said, I found this at a pawn shop years back. He said, I knew it belonged to someone who loved deep. He said, I think it belonged to your father or to his friend. Maya unfolded the cloth and pressed it to her chest. She said, my father carried a flag like this on our porch. She said he said it was a promise to stand for each other. She said, thank you for bringing this home to me. Clint nodded and looked at the ground and then at the sky. He said, I plan to visit the graves I have avoided. He said, I plan to speak their names and ask for mercy. Maya placed a hand on his shoulder and blessed his path. That evening, Mason read his journal to the circle. He read, I felt rage today, and I breathed until it passed. He read, I saw someone from my old crew, and I prayed. He read, I did not run, and I did not attack, and I waited. He read, the fear left, and the person left, and peace stayed. The men clapped and Lily smiled, and Maya said, well done. Mason closed the book and looked around the room. He said, I used to think power was loud and sharp. He said, now I see power as quiet and steady. He said, I want to build more than I ever broke. That night they drew up plans on cardboard sheets. They planned a reading hour and a job fair and a clinic. They planned music lessons and a group for fathers and sons. They planned a table where anyone could come just to talk. Each plan had names and dates and small steps to start. Maya watched the room and felt a soft pride rise. She saw how far they had come from that first night. She knew how far there was still to go on the road. Yet she trusted the road because she trusted the walkers. She whispered, I rise again, and the room seemed to glow. If this story touched your heart, if it made you feel the fire of courage and the power of change, then do not let it stop here. Give this video a like so more people can hear it. Share it with someone who needs hope today, and make sure you subscribe to this channel because More stories of strength and rising again are coming your way. Together, we can spread light in places where darkness thinks it still rules. So join us on this journey and let us rise again side by side.